Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's story is a very strange, creepy story surrounding two young boys who live in a very rural community, who are then caught up in a series of particularly creepy, strange, unexplainable events. Without further ado, let's get into tonight's story entitled Things Best Left in the Woods. The first thing you should know is that this story doesn't have an ending. It stops, certainly, but there is no climax to the events herein. They're just sort of fizzled out. The other thing you should know is that this is a true story. Not a true story like you might find on certain other subreddits dedicated to spooky stories, but a genuinely true retelling of a short-lived period of strangeness during my youth. Some allowances must be made for the sake of narrative, of course, but I will do my best to avoid any embellishment. This is the story of what my friend and I found in the woods during the summer of 2007, and that strangeness that surrounded those months. Geography is not important to this story, not even necessarily to the events themselves, but rather their character. I grew up in a small rural community in the valley about 8 hours drive north of Seattle. The area is a mix of sprawling farmland sandwiched between the Puget Sound and the San Juan Islands to the west, and the damp foothills of the Cascade Mountains to the east. Most of the strangeness which occurred during the summer of 2007 took place in the latter of those environments, but eventually spilled out into the community proper. Growing up in such a varied and open place has many benefits. However, the threat of boredom was also a constant. I had known my friend S since elementary school, and at this time we were both in our junior year of high school. We were both quite musically inclined from a young age, though by high school he was much more successful at picking up girls with his guitar and singer's voice than I was with my classical percussion. Turns out chicks don't really dig timpani. He was the more outgoing and gregarious of the two of us, while I was the bookish, introspective type. While I lived out in the farmland of our valley, S was at this time living with his father in a house built overlooking a lake in the Cascade foothills. It was a bit of a drive out there, but S's house was also equipped with the latest bits of tech we enjoyed. One of the few benefits of living with a bachelor father, tokens to make up for the bouts of alcoholic absenteeism, I always suspected. The area in which S lived was one which had seemingly always avoided any successful attempt at permanent inhabituation. Attempts were made back in the pioneer days to form a community in the steep pine and fir-lined bowl that the lake sits in, but none managed to survive for more than a few years. Today, a small collection of homes sit looking down on the lake, mostly retirees and an artist or two, shadowed by the large hills surrounding it. The area is perpetually wet and cold, with clumps of moss and fern growing thick and wild under the trees. This was the backdrop for our strangeness. It was not long after school ended for the summer that S and I found ourselves sitting in the half-finished basement, really a split level, of his father's house playing Guitar Hero 2 and Halo 2. S was much better at Guitar Hero and I was better at Halo. It must have been around 6 o'clock when we heard his father upstairs yelling, either into the phone or at the TV, and S suggested we go for a walk. This happened to be the preferred method of shaking off our teenage frustrations at our parents. So I completely understood and agreed. We left the house and walked up into the woods, finding a path that ran along the hill. It was about 20 minutes into this walk that we rounded a corner and stopped in amazement. Standing about 30 feet ahead of us on the trail was an albino buck. There had been rumours circulating among the hunters at school about the deer, driven by a posting from the local Fish and Wildlife Office not to shoot the rare deer if it was spotted. This of course led to a great desire among some of those hunters to bag the deer for themselves. Laws be damned. The deer stood and stared back at us for a good few seconds before turning and bolting off into the woods. S and I searched around briefly in an attempt to find the white buck again, but to no success. We turned around and headed back to S's house, having got hungry. This event marks the beginning of our involvement with the strangeness. About a week after our encounter with the albino buck, S called me in a rather foul mood. A pair of sheriff's deputies had knocked on his door and demanded to speak with S. They questioned him about his recent activities and whereabouts. A couple of pets had gone missing in the area over the course of the previous few nights, and one of the elderly neighbours had spotted S on one of his evening walks. Being upset over the disappearance of their pet and ever suspicious of teenagers, the neighbour had accused S of stealing the pet. The deputies nor the neighbour could prove anything. However, the pair left S with a vague warning against any wrongdoings. S saw the albino buck again that very night. Several more weeks passed and the pet disappearances continued around the lake. A dog here, a cat there. People chalked it up to coyotes or perhaps a mountain lion, but there were whispers about things that didn't add up. A dog going missing from a locked kennel. The silence where there should have been barks and yowls. S and his father fought often during this time, sparked off by his encounter with the police. As a result, S was often in strange moods when we spoke or hung out. I was once again over at S's house when one of these pensive moods struck. Growing suddenly bored with our usual video games, S asked me if I wanted to go see the cemetery. McMurray Cemetery is a diminutive old pioneer cemetery, abandoned since the last burial there in the early 1930s. Set back from the road in the trees, no sign marks its own entrance. Its ownership has long been in question, and the only care it has seen in nearly a century has been sporadic maintenance from local Boy Scout troops. Few in the area even know it was there, but S had discovered it on one of his walks. He had never taken me there, saying the place gave him the creeps. I don't know what compelled him to take me there that evening. It took us around half hour to reach the cemetery, taking the same winding forest path as before. We talked about the fights that S and his father had been having, and the animal disappearances. S mentioned that he had been thinking about the buck often, the albino buck. He even thought about writing a song about it. It took me a bit by surprise when we entered the overgrown clearing, as I suddenly noticed the tumble-down headstones. The whole place was thick with ferns and moss, and it seemed to smell of damp and rot. We walked around the clearing for some time, making circles of the graves. There was a feeling about that place, something old, primal. It felt like it had always been there, rotting. It may have been my overactive teenage imagination, but the place felt wrong. There was seemingly no rhyme nor reason to the placement of the graves, as if they had been picked up and scattered around. One grave stood out among the rest. Set in the rear of the clearing, it was a crude tomb, really just a granite box. If there was once a name to it, it had long since eroded away. S and I stood there for some time just looking at it, and I began to grow uncomfortable. I am not at all one who is frightened by cemeteries or graves, but this place felt different. When I asked S if we could go, I realised it was the first thing that either of us had said since we had arrived. I don't remember if we talked at all on the walk back, though I do remember that my socks had gotten soaked through. The old Chuck Taylors I had been wearing, and they just wouldn't warm up. Getting back to S's house, I wrung them out. The black water just poured out of the socks. Something I had seen at the graves had been bugging me. Some of the grass around the tomb had recently trampled down. I asked S if he had been there recently. S told me this evening was the only second time he'd ever been there. The first being when he found the place as a kid. The feeling of that decrepit graveyard struck with me for some time. I remember having nightmares about the place. Nothing really specific, just a vague sense of foreboding and wrongness. About another month passed before S and I hung out once again at his house. S had continued to talk about the albino buck, going so far as to draw up a design for a tattoo of it, which, incidentally, he would eventually get done. It turned out quite well. It was after dinner that night that S and his father got into a proper screaming match. I hid awkwardly down in the basement, half playing Halo and trying to ignore the yelling coming from up the stairs. After some time, S stomped downstairs and said he wanted to go for a walk. I gave some weak protest that it was starting to get dark, but S said we'd take our flashlights and stop being a little bitch. He was in one of his moods again. I agreed to go with him, my desire to not be alone with his brooding father outweighing my apprehension about going back into the woods. Grabbing a pair of cheap flashlights, we headed out into the forest. It was dark in the trees, with just enough twilight filtering in to make out shapes. The sort of dark that seems to drain all the colour out of the world. We walked for some time, the silence broken only by the occasional outburst of teenage angst and frustration from S. We rounded the same corner of the trail where we had previously seen the albino buck, when S started, with surprise, in front of me. The albino buck was standing in the light of S's flashlight, not 15 feet in front of us. Again, it looked at us for a moment, then turned and sped down the trail. S started off after it, with me following behind against my better judgment. We would round a bend and the buck would be standing there on the trail, looking back at us. This continued for some few minutes, during which I realised we were headed back down towards the cemetery. I did not want to go back there, certainly not in the dark. By the time I caught back up to S, we were both standing on the edge of the clearing, watching the buck bound over a wall of undergrowth on the far side. I don't remember which one of us spotted the holes first. Running our lights over the clearing, we could see the clearing riddled with holes and piles of dirt. Dozens of them, here and there. The smell of rot and wet was absolutely overwhelming. I believe I was in the middle of saying, "What the f..." when S turned his flashlight towards the back of the graveyard and screamed. I still see that tomb in my nightmares. Someone had stacked it high with bones. Human skulls, some intact and others shattered, lined the front of it, staring back at us with hollow eyes. They were covered in blood. Piled in a heap at the bottom of the tomb was the mutilated, butchered corpses of several dogs and cats in various states of decay. We stood there, stock still, for a moment. I remember my eyes fixing on the blood that ran down the skulls and onto the face of the tomb, and realizing that only fresh blood could shine so bright and wet in our flashlight beams. It only took a few seconds before we were running with all our speed back towards the house. The rest of the night was long. Bursting through the door in panic, S's father's previous anger turned quickly to concern as we described what we saw. The police were called and we each gave a statement. The exhumed bones were re-entered as best possible, and the animals were identified as some of those that had gone missing. No arrests were ever made, nor was the story ever made particularly public. School started up not too long after that, and S and I slowly drifted apart over the senior year. His relationship with his father did improve after the incident. However, the animal disappearances and deaths continued for some months after as well, spreading out across the valley into the more populated areas. That next spring, my family's cat Sky was found by a neighbour, cut fully in half in his driveway. The disappearances eventually petered out. Again, no arrests were ever made. The next summer, the cemetery was once again restored and cleaned by a local Boy Scout troop, and since then the area around it has been logged and cleared for some new houses. I don't know whether the death of my family's cat and the pet killings up in the hills were connected or not, but if something, I don't particularly care to think about. Either way, that night was the last time I ever went up to that isolated lake in the wet and shadowed foothills of the Cascades. Wow, I hope you guys enjoyed that story. Please do let me know down below in the comments. As ever, please do like and share. And remember guys, be safe, not sorry.